Hey guys, welcome to the Matt Powers Show podcast. I am your host, Matt Powers, former cartoon character and comic book superhero, current elder millennial podcasting from his mother's basement. Why? Well, that's what elder millennials do. Today I wanted to talk about something in comic books that I've been noticing more and more, is that comic books don't seem to care about the lengthy continuity anymore. And let me first explain what I'm talking about before we get into this. So what I've noticed is the big two companies, Marvel and DC, who have been around forever, and of course have had comics going all the way back to the 60s and 50s and 40s even. They had, for a long time, especially up into the 90s, had basically had a run of comics. Okay, if you bought Amazing Spider-Man, you could buy issue number 1, right, from 1963 or whatever. And you could buy it all the way up to issue 715. I don't know, whatever number the issue would get to, or was at that time. It was a ongoing serial, right? It was a soap opera basically for kids. And at some point in time in the 90s, we'll talk about why I think what happened that really picked out where this started happening. At some point in time in the 90s, all of a sudden, everything sort of ended, and we started getting these reboots, where they would say, okay, we're not going to do any more, Avengers comics. We're going to start over at number 1. We're not going to do any more Captain America. We're going to start over at number 1. And it was jarring. It was very jarring for people. And I think at that time, going into the 2000s, as this was happening, I think people were really kind of pushing back against it, saying, I don't want to have renumbered series. I don't want to start over at number 1. You were at issue 612. Next one should be 613. Come on, let's keep going. Let's do this. But while they did, eventually most of that stuff went back to being renumbered. In the 2000s, we started seeing books being canceled, new books starting. Okay, the Mighty Avengers ended, the New Avengers started. Okay. And other books similar to that. I'm using Marvel because I read a lot of Marvel in the 2000s, so I think I have a better sight on this than others. DC really wouldn't start this problem until the late 2000s with the New 52. We'll get to that in a second. Fast forward to today, okay? We're sort of looking at, I want to say, the hyperinflation version of this. Just in the last 5 years, books go for 12 issues, they go for maybe a year or two, and then they get cut, and then a new status quo starts, and we start over numbering with brand new books. And this happens time after time. The X-Men are a truly great example of this happening in Marvel Comics, where we had a long-running X-Men series, or several X-Men series, and they all just sort of stopped. And then after the Avengers vs. X-Men storyline, and when they restarted, they were a new type of X-Men. They were Avengers and X-Men working together, but they were renumbered. And then they stopped. They brought in the classic X-Men. The original team were brought to the future so that they got their own series. And the other X books went on for a little bit, the all-new X-Men, and then that stopped. And then they restarted again as a new X-Men series. And this has gone on and on and on, over and over again for years. Until recently, Hickman sort of restarts the clock again with his House of X, Powers of 10 storyline, and then throws the X-Men into the new status quo. And always, whenever they do this, it always seems to come with a status quo change. That we're going to renumber books, we're going to relaunch books, they're going to have new titles, and it's a new status quo. And to get people excited, and you start reading, and then pretty soon that ends, and they do it all over again. Now, why would they do this? Okay, here's sort of my theory of what they're doing. I think, and this is kind of the purpose of this podcast, I think Marvel has realized that if they try to stick people to reading 30, 40, 50 years of continuity, they're losing. I think people don't want to go back and read the old stuff. A lot of people who get into comics, friends of mine who got into comics late in their life say, man, I got to go back and read all this old stuff. And then after a year or so, they say, man, there's just too much out there. I just can't read it all. I can't get a hold of it all. It's constantly referencing things. I don't know what's going on. And I think Marvel figured that out. back in the 90s, there was a big X-Men event they did called the Age of Apocalypse. Now, if you don't know what this is, basically the X books have been going on and on and on and on and on and on and on for years and years and years, and then they had a big storyline where the universe ended. And it sort of reboot because time was rewritten. So now you had brand new books. You had, instead of having Uncanny X-Men, you had, I think it was, you had Extreme X-Men. Instead of having X-Men or New X-Men, you know, you had, it was all new X-Men or something to those effects. There were new X books, new teams, and a new reality where the villains had won and the X-Men were just playing catch-up trying to save the human race. And it is one of the highest selling runs of X-Men books in the history of X-Men. Because it was so different, it was so unique. No one had ever seen a storyline like that before, where the books themselves are interrupted with these brand new stories and a new continuity. And eventually that universe ended and they fixed it, and then everything went back to normal, because that's what these books do. They're a big soap opera. They always go back to a status quo, as it were. But think about that. If your biggest selling X book in the history of X-Men was when you basically just threw everything away and just did something brand new and called them new things, and they were still the same characters, but it was different versions of those characters, then you might begin to think, wow, maybe everything should do that. Maybe that's how we have to generate more money, to get more people reading the books. It's all about money, right? To get more money, we have to do this. In the 2000s, we get a guy named Brian Michael Bendis starts writing the Avengers books, okay? And what he did was, every year, there was a big Marvel event, okay? A big event. So all the books would cross over for this massive event that would change everything in the Marvel universe. And to be fair, it did, right? The events were big and they did change things in the Marvel universe. But again, it kept resetting status quos every year, these big events. And you were, not only did you want to read your books, but you had to go buy the event books as well. And this kept happening year after year after year after year, to the point where new series were born out of these events. So if you were reading the Mighty Avengers, well, Avengers Disassembled happens, that's the big event, and then now you have to read the New Avengers because the Mighty Avengers is done. Okay, well then they had another big event later on called Civil War, and at the end of Civil War, the New Avengers continued on, but now you had the Secret Avengers book, which were a different Avengers team that you had to follow. And over time, maybe they'll consolidate those, and they relaunched the Mighty Avengers. But then the New Avengers went away, but the Secret Avengers became something else, and so on and so forth. To the point where you felt like you were constantly swapping out titles and swapping characters and swapping books, and if you liked certain characters, it almost became impossible to follow them through all the different changes that were happening. To the point where, if they were doing that because people couldn't get into the previous 30 years of history, now you had a decade where it was impossible to get into it because you'd have to go back and you'd have to try to read all these big events that happened. And that's a whole list, you know, and that's a lot of books to read. So I think Marvel, at the end of that, began to realize if we're ever going to get people interested in comics, every potential issue has to be someone's first issue. Every series has to be someone's first series. Because now, what I'm seeing, or what I've experienced, and tell me if I'm wrong, tell me if you've experienced something else, but every year it's like we just throw away everything. Unless it's selling really well, like Jonathan Hickman's X-Men is selling really well, so they're not going to throw that away. That's still going. That's been going for a couple of years now. But other stuff, we'll just throw it away. You know? Now let's try a year where Peter Parker isn't Spider-Man anymore, but Doc Ock becomes Spider-Man. Oh, okay. Now let's do a year where Miles Morales is Spider-Man. Well, now we just had a Spider-Verse movie, so let's do Into the Spider-Verse, the comic series. And and you don't have to have read anything else. You could just jump in here. It's a brand new slate. We'll introduce everything you hear and move forward. Okay, wow. So you say, well, but Matt, what's the problem with that? That sounds like a really good business model for comics. So people don't have to go back and read 30 or 40 years worth, 50 years worth of back issues. You're absolutely right. Except that there was always a shared continuity, an ongoing continuity. They were soap operas. And with any good soap opera, while they might reboot the soap opera, every 20 years or so with new characters and new locations and new story ideas, if you've been watching All My Children all your life, yeah, you can still go back and see how stories are connecting to the old stuff. That's how comic books were. Serialized content. But today, they've thrown that out. Today, anytime you want to get into something, you just get into whatever the newest story is, read that, and be done with it. Almost to the point that they're not serialized anymore. They're little mini-series. They're 12 issues, 16 issues, 6 issues. You know, you're almost guaranteed that the book will be done before you hit your next birthday. And then you just read the next thing. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. I'm not a fan of it as a comic collector because I love the continual serialization of comics. I love that Amazing Spider-Man, that Peter Parker has 30, 40, 50 years of Spider-Man stories. You know? I like having those volumes sitting on my shelf. I buy them in trade, right? Instead of, I don't know, you can't go back and buy an Amazing Fantasies 15 or Amazing Spider-Man #1, not unless you're rich. But I can buy the trades that are only $12, $15, and I can put them on my shelf. You know? I like that. I like having an ongoing narrative. I'm a TV fan. I like television. I like how television in a series will go on and on and on for years and years and years. And if you have a spin-off show, it's tangentially connected to the other show that it was a part of. But what are we looking at today? We're looking at an industry which is just throwing away continuity. Throwing away that sort of cohesive, ongoing narrative. Just saying, look, just buy this one storyline and see if you like it. And if you don't, that's cool. Buy this other storyline. You like that one? Okay, well, we're going to do a third storyline. Maybe you like that one. You don't have to have read the other two to read the third one. It's fine. Read whatever you want. Personally, I don't think that's a good route for comics. But that's me. So this is what's been on my mind. Have you guys noticed this? Has anyone else out there seen sort of the throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the continuity issue? They're just, I mean, yes, there is still references to older continuity. I'm not saying there isn't. You can read the new X-Men stuff, and they will make references to things that have happened. But are they? I mean, I read some of the newer X-Men stuff. They don't seem to care about the minutia of storylines that happened in the 70s or the 80s. They don't make reference to stuff. They make reference to the bigger archetypes of X-Men. But they don't seem to care about the fact that there was a storyline where, you know, they were all in the Savage Land this one time, and while they were there, you know, Rogue and Magneto hooked up. You know? Oh, we're never going to reference that again. Even though these two characters now work together all the time. You know, well, that's not an important piece of their history anymore. That's gone. Who cares? It's these soft reboots. That's what it feels like. It feels like everything now is just a soft reboot, so you can kind of disregard the old stuff. So, why did I say about DC and the New 52? That's the perfect example of how this happened. For DC, they had ongoing narratives forever. And now, yeah, to be fair, yes, all you comic nerds who are raging right now at the moment, hold on. I know that they do the big crisis events to sort of rewrite their history. I get that. I'm saying you didn't need to. I could go back and read the stuff pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it would still matter to the modern day comics. It was still part of the story. Or I could start at Crisis on Infinite Earths and move on. Or I could start at Infinite Crisis and move on. Or I could start at Final Crisis and move on. I get that. New 52 was DC throwing everything else away and saying we are going to completely reboot our entire line of comics. But we're not going to reboot it. We're going to soft reboot it. So, you know what? We might reference previous stories, and let's pretend like that stuff happened. And if we liked a particular story, if we think a particular story is good and works for the current narrative we're writing, we'll say it happened. Now you can go buy that trade. Which is a very business proposition move to make, right? That is a business decision 100%. In no way does that serve a creative storyline, and in every way does that serve the pocketbooks of DC Comics. Because then they'll say, not only do you get to start over with these comics, but every now and then we're going to force you to shell out $25 or $30 to buy this old trade. And then, of course, that went on for many years, and people didn't like it, so what did they do? Well, they came back to the current timeline, the present timeline, where everything was included. But we keep pulling in New 52, pieces into the current timeline, because some of that was good. Some people like the new stuff. It just, over and over again, it feels like these companies, especially now, have given up on serialization and ongoing continuity. Thrown it all out, so you just start over wherever you want to start. You pick a spot that you like, you read just those stories, and you're done with it. And maybe that is the future of comics. Maybe that's where comic books need to go. Maybe, I have been forever, I've been arguing that Marvel should end all of its books and start a brand new series of books, say, call it 30 years from now, right? Say 30 years later is kind of the tagline for this new series. And it's taking the archetypes of characters, creating new characters that fit within the archetypes. What is Peter Parker Spider-Man but a kid down on his luck who gets superpowers and he can never seem to juggle or you never seem to handle juggling his home life and his superhero life? Well, that could be anybody. Who cares what the name is? Who cares what you call the kid, what the powers are? The archetype of the character is that old Parker Luck. So you could invent a new character that does the exact same thing, but with new stories from a different cultural background to give diversity into comics, which I think comics desperately need. And you can say, okay, well, this isn't Spider-Man. This is, I have no idea. I'm not creating the comic. I would call him Blast Man or something because I'm not creative at all, right? But I'm just saying you could invent a new character that you pull from the same well and just write new stories. You could do that for everything. Set it 30 years in the future, so that way you cut all previous continuity out. Right? And then you set up a mystery of where the heroes haven't been around for. We don't know what happened. One day there was a big fight and everybody disappeared. Who knows what happened? Now we're getting new superheroes. And every now and then we'll meet an old character who's much older now. I at some point in time, maybe 50 or 60 years of continuity can't be kept. That makes sense too. But you want to keep the brands going. So I feel like comics have found a way to do that. They're just cutting out the need for ever reading anything other than what they're currently publishing. And that, as a collector, kills me. And as a longtime fan, worries me. But as somebody who does not have the money to keep collecting anymore, or the time, who maybe just wants to really quickly read something about some characters that he used to enjoy, you can just pick up a new story, read it, and be done. What do you guys think? Leave some comments below what you think. All I ask is that you be civil in the comments, right? It's okay to disagree with me. It's okay to think that I'm wrong about this. You can let me know your reasonings why. Just, be nice about it. Don't attack anyone in the comments. Or if you want to send me an email, davidcampproductions@gmail.com. Send me an email there. I'll read it in private, and then we can talk about it on another podcast if you'd like. Anyway, that's what was on my mind today. Hope you guys are having a wonderful day. We're getting close to the end of the year here, and starting in January, there's going to be a bit of a rebranding for this podcast. I've really enjoyed doing what I'm doing. I'm going to keep doing these as I'm doing them. I have some ideas on how to shake up the branding a little bit and kind of make it geared a little more towards just me having ideas and less about what we're doing here. But also, I want to do something more with the Matt Power Show as a show. It was always meant to be sort of a Space Ghost Coast to Coast style parody, and we never quite got to that point. And I think the show itself should become that, something scripted, something funny with interviews and stuff. Well, this is just the podcast that I do. So anyway, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. I love you all. Make sure to do the YouTube shuffle. I know you guys are sick and tired of hearing it. Like the video to help me out, or dislike it if you don't like it. That's fine. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't, please. That really helps me out. But you will know all that stuff. You've heard every podcaster say it since the beginning of time on YouTube. So I appreciate you guys coming out here. And as always, this is Matt Powers finishing up my podcast by saying, Powers out.
Vortex.